Hello and welcome to Ride Rescue. In this episode we'll talk a little bit more about the Pontiac, the 1960 bubble top that dragged out of the garage. Since the car was sitting in the garage for 40 years and the owner said, hey, it ran when I parked it, we've heard that before, I did feel pretty comfortable with the fact that it was in the garage, and I never even thought about maybe I should turn it over, maybe I should put a battery in it and see if anything works. But I was excited about the car. I trusted the guy when he said it ran when I parked it. He said it ran terrible, but it was in running condition. He hadn't done anything with it. He hadn't winterized it, which was something I really didn't even think about, and I should have, because I ran into that problem once before. Years ago, I bought a 67 Firebird with a 400 in it, and it had been sitting in a garage, and I didn't check the block, and it had froze and broke. And this car being in the garage underneath the house with the motor towards the front of the garage, it was pretty covered and pretty safe that it wasn't likely that it was going to freeze and break. And so it was quite a risk. It's not something that's easy to check. There's two cars. I'm thinking, well, maybe between the two cars I'm bound to have an engine that's good. The car that's been sitting out, that was a real risk. Typically when they've been sitting out, I bought a Le Mans, a 63 Le Mans with a 326 V8 that had filled up with water and condensation, and it was just a complete rusted, locked up motor. So always a risk when you've had a car sitting this long, but it was a leap of faith. I bought them for such a great price. I knew I could part them out. I just wanted to get them home, start going through everything and see if I can get them to start, see if I can get them to turn over. And I've just got my fingers crossed that I'm going to end up with something pretty decent. So as an overall inspection of the car, as I'm looking at all over the outside, I'm seeing a little bit of rust. There's a little bit of rust holes, as you would typically expect, especially in northern Utah. Both of these cars were originally purchased in northern Utah. It's kind of ironic. When the red one was found in Nevada, I would have expected that it most likely had come from that territory. But when I traced the information back from the original owner and the paperwork that I had before it was abandoned, the car was actually sold in the same area as the gray car. They were both from the same dealership. So it's kind of ironic. Both cars were hundreds of miles apart, and they ended up back together in a junkyard that wasn't too far from where they were originally sold. But that particular area of Utah, we do use salt on the roads there, so both cars did sustain some salt damage from winter driving, but nowhere near as bad as I would have expected for the area. So I don't think the red car stayed in Utah for very long. I think it did spend a lot of its time in Nevada. So it got the initial rust damage in the trunk and in the rockers, but then when it ended up in Nevada, wherever part of Nevada it did end up, they don't use the salts on the roads like we do. So the car didn't end up getting any more rust damage than it would have if it would have stayed in Utah. And looking the cars over, my thought was, yeah, it looks like it's all original paint, but there was some areas where I could see one front fender had been repainted, it had been damaged, and it had to have been damaged probably in the 60s because all the body work on that fender was done with lead. So you very rarely just see lead in the 70s. There was only a handful of old school guys that were doing body work and re-leading panels. So I was surprised to see that. So that panel, which was actually the driver's side front fender, had been repaired and repainted. The passenger side fender, front fender, had some repair work, a little bit of repair work, and it had been touched up, not completely repainted, just that one little area had been touched up. And then on the front of the hood, you could see where it had been maybe scuffed because they couldn't find any damage. There's no filler that I could tell, and it's just a little area that's been spot painted. So as far as I could tell, those are the only parts of this car that look like it's ever had any work, metal-wise and paint-wise. All the rest of the car is completely original paint. The paint on the roof, that cream color, very rusty, a lot of scratches. The rest of the car has a lot of scratches. The guy had been stacking parts on the trunk and on the roof over the years in his garage and dragging it off, so it was dragging off some of the paint. But it is the original paint, and you just don't see that. Even as bad as the paint is, it is all there, and the majority of it is original. So I want to keep as much of that factory original finish as I can. I will go ahead and refinish both front fenders, especially because they have the big rust holes. The fenders are off the car, I might as well do it. The lead area, they did a really good job. The lead is adhered, it doesn't have any rust going underneath it. I don't want to take that out, so I will just work around that lead, and it's got some edges of the lead that have receded a little bit, so I will sand and make sure there's no rust getting underneath that, and I will just fill over it. I don't want to take all the lead out, especially with the grinder. You don't want to grind on lead without having all the equipment because you get lead poisoning, so I don't even want to mess with that. And since I'm going to try and keep it a little bit rough and a little bit scuffed up, even when I do finish both of these front fenders, I'm going to scuff them up a little bit and try to match that original finish without it being real obvious that I tried to match it, or real obvious that they're brand new shiny paint. So just kind of dull them up a little bit and not worry too much about getting any chips or scratches as I'm putting the car back together. So the front fenders, the one front fender on the passenger side, not only did it have rust in the bottom of it, but it really got mangled. So where the car is obviously scuffed something because there's damage in the door and there's damage in the rear quarter panel, the front fender really got wrinkled up at the bottom of it. So I might have to take the fender off the parts car and use that as well. I'm hoping I can save the red one because the top of the red fender is all really, really solid. And the gray car, the top of the fender actually has some rust and it's got some bulging where it's laminated together and spot welded. So I really don't want to use that fender. Worst case scenario, I might end up just cutting the fender, the lower section off of that fender and welding it on to the red fender. I'm hoping I can salvage the red fender. I'm hoping I can straighten it out, but it is pretty stretched and it is pretty mangled. So I'll probably end up having to cut that off. So after looking at everything cosmetically, I mean the interior, as you can see in these pictures, the interior looks great. It's just got a little bit of a hole in the driver's side seat. The foam feels good, the springs feel good. The carpet, I tried to pull the carpet back to see the floor to see if there was any rust, and it just completely disintegrated and fell apart. So the front carpet I pulled out and threw away. The rear carpet is fair, it's holding together. I was able to lift it up. I can see underneath it. It's got a little bit of surface rust, but the floors are really clean in this car. So that's exciting. So of the two cars, when the red car was parked, according to the previous owner, he said everything worked. Him and his buddy did drive it around the neighborhood. Said it ran just absolutely horrible, but everything was working, and he claimed that the speedometer had the original miles, 89,000 original miles. So fairly low miles actually for a car this old, but considering it had only been driven for about 15 years when it was parked, that's probably about average miles, maybe a little below. Now the gray car actually only has 70,000 original miles, and being how it was wrecked the way it was, and at the time that it was wrecked in 73, it was only 13 years after the car was purchased, and it's a gas guzzling pig, so I don't imagine that anybody drove these cars a whole lot. So I'm confident that 70,000 miles on the gray car is the actual miles. So at this point now, I'm thinking, all right, let's just get them running, and I'll try to decide which one I want to keep. Preferably, I would like to use the low mileage engine out of the gray car, especially when the red car, I already have comments from the original owner about how horrible it was running. So I need to drain the oil in both of them, check the oil, make sure there isn't any metal fragments in it, really inspect the motors and make sure that nothing is really obviously damaged or frozen and broken or anything that way. So the red car had an intake manifold sitting on the motor. It was bolted down and it didn't have a carburetor on it. It was just a 2-barrel manifold that had been set on top of it. So I got the carburetor. It was actually, there was a carburetor that was in the trunk. The gray car was very similar. It didn't have a carburetor on it either, which is kind of scary, but luckily the previous owner had stuffed rags down into the holes on top of the intake manifolds. So I'm not sure why the carburetors were off of both cars, but they were. Luckily there was one carburetor there that I could kind of clean up a little bit and make sure everything was moving. I just set it into place and put in a couple of bolts to kind of hold it down, poured in a little fuel and hit the starter. With a new battery in it, it cranked over pretty quick. The gray car fired right up. I was shocked. I had checked the oil and made sure it had oil in it. The oil was pretty dark, pretty ugly, but I'm not planning on running for very long. I just want to be able to just move things a little bit and then I'll shut it back off. And it fired up, and the cloud of rust that came out of the back of the car was just way beyond anything you could ever imagine. There was this huge rust circle around the back end of the car from the exhaust system. It had so much condensation and rust inside of those pipes. I was really shocked at how much that rust came out. Since the car started so easily and it ran so well, I had somebody help me where we could just keep putting in a little bit of fuel and a little bit of fuel and keep it running just to see how smooth it would run. And I was surprised at how smooth that car just purred. There was no shimmy or shaking. It didn't sound like there was any miss in it. And so I knew it had a really good motor with the gray car. So then the red car, I wanted to do the same thing with it and put the carburetor on it, poured a little bit of fuel in it, and it just did not want to start. It would just chug and burp and backfire, and I just really struggled to finally get it to fire up. And then when it did fire, man, it was just shaking and ran horrible. It was obvious it wasn't running on all cylinders. So I knew the red car definitely had some issues. So now that I know I've got one really good motor in the gray car and I'm not too sure about the motor in the red car, the low miles on the gray car, probably going to be best to just transplant the motors. Grab that one, put it in the red one. I was really hoping to have numbers matching, but I can't find any codes, numbers, anything on these blocks. And I've got online and I've done a lot of research, and the Pontiac websites are saying, well, in the 1960s, they really didn't have codes. They didn't have VIN number matching. So it really doesn't matter if you switch the motors. Well, in that case, then absolutely, I'm going to switch them over. So the first thing I do before I start pulling these motors out is I'm going to drain the oil on both cars and see what the oil looks like. So I drained the oil on the red car, and sure enough, it's got metal fragments in the motor. There's even actually little pieces, not just the little shiny spots in the oil, but there was little pieces of what looks like bearings or aluminum that's sitting in the oil pan. So I'm pretty sure then that there's damage to this motor. Could be a cylinder, could be a piston. While I'm pulling the engine out and getting everything ready, I'm trying to lighten it up. These things are so heavy. The intake manifold is a cast iron manifold and it's already loose, so I took all the bolts off of that, took it out of place, looked down inside of the motor, and I can see the cam and the cam bearings, and there's pieces of the cam bearing sticking out of the front of the cam. So I know that one is bad, and that's most likely where this metal fragments are coming from. So not sure how much more damage there is to that. Whoever was driving it when they finally abandoned the car was probably just really racing it, high revving it, putting it through a lot of torture. when things just started to come apart. And there's probably a lot more damage in this motor than just these bearings and the camshaft. So now I'm really convinced that I want to use the motor out of the gray car. So I'm not being really careful with it. I'm just trying to get it all out. I'm just pulling it all apart. I'm daintily taking the motor out of the gray car, and I've got it in. I set it on the floor in front of the red car. I'm going to do a swap. And as I'm pulling everything apart off of the red car, and I want to use some of the parts off of it, so I can swap back and forth on when it comes to water pumps and timing chain covers and things that way. I'm looking at, well, what can be salvaged, what can I sell on eBay, and I'm taking off the front cover off the front of the motor, and lo and behold, I see numbers. So I scrape and I clean and I wire brush, and there's the VIN number that matches the car. So now I've got another thing to think about. If this block is a mate to the car, then I'd really like to keep a numbers matching engine for something like this car where everything is the original interior and original paint. It would really be nice to have the original engine too. With a car that's been sitting for 40 years, the gray car's engine most likely is going to need a lot of work. I know I'm going to have to put seals in it. I know it's going to be leaking. So if I'm going to be blowing an engine apart, I might as well blow apart the red engine and let's just see, make sure that it is usable and can be salvaged, and maybe I can put it all back together with the best parts from both cars. So that's what I ended up doing. So once I strip the block all down, one of the first things I notice as I'm taking everything off the front of the motor is the block is full of rust. All the ports, the cooling ports, the water pump is solid rust. The water pump, there's no way it's going to turn over. All the fins are rusted together. It's just this big clump. I've never seen anything like it. All the water jackets in the car, all the freeze plugs are rotted through. You can see there was a water line inside of the block when I looked down into the ports where it had most likely been left with water, not antifreeze. And as the water line slowly evaporated down, it got to the point where it left like this crusty edge around everything inside of the motor and inside of the ports, where it's like ice shelf of rust. Never seen anything like that. And where it finally lowered down to the point where the rust shelf was really forming, it was right about at the freeze plugs on the side of the block and on the front of the block, and they rusted through, and then all the water finally was able to not only drain out of those areas, but then get enough airflow in there from all the rust holes where it actually drained out. So I was beginning to think now at this point that the block probably isn't going to be savable. But as I'm cleaning it all up, not only do I find the serial number, but I find the A1 symbol. The A1 indication on this block is a high compression motor. High compression motors were common in the Venturas, but it's more of a rare engine and a highly desirable engine for guys that want to put on high performance intake manifolds, high performance 4-barrel carburetors, or in the case that the previous owner was doing with this one, was getting one of the original intake manifolds for a 6-pack and the 3 carburetors. And having the 1959 intake and carburetors that he had sitting on his workbench, that tied everything together. So I really wanted to restore and keep this engine block. The A1 engine will not only have higher compression ratio, but it'll typically come with a camshaft that's more of a performance cam too. So I want to be able to research all that, and I really want to keep this motor. So we send the block out to a machine shop, have them boil it all out, have them clean it all up, get all the rust out of it, and then inspect it and make sure there's no cracks, there's no real heavy damage anywhere. Make sure we can just put in new freeze plugs, and hopefully the motor is good and it can all go back together, and that original block will go back in that car. And long story short, it was. The block was absolutely amazing. When it cleaned up so well. There was just a slight ridge on the cylinders. There was hardly anywhere. All it needed was new bearings, new rings, a new oil pump, put everything all back together with all new seals, and this is going to be a fantastic motor. So while the engine's at the shop, getting completely rebuilt, everything's going back together, I'm really excited about it. Well, now I'm going to have this beautiful jewel sitting on a rusty, grimy frame with rusty, grimy parts going all around it. Well, I can't have that. I mean, the car's all blown apart on the front end. Everything's exposed, everything's in pieces, everything's in boxes. So as I'm putting everything back together, I'm going to make sure to restore every single piece. Once this is all finished and the whole front end is back together, I want to be able to open up the hood and see everything in that engine bay perfect, just like it came from the factory. Nothing in the engine bay has ever been tinkered with. All the original wiring, all the original brakes and the brake booster and steering components and hoses, everything in it was the way it came and was just neglected. So it's really easy at this point to see there's little paint dabs when things were checked and inspected that are still there. As I'm cleaning the grime off, I can tell what was originally anodized or cadmium coated or silver plated, so it's really fascinating as I'm cleaning up all these parts to see how this car would have been right out of the factory. It doesn't have the corrosion that you would typically see on a car that is set this long, so it still has a lot of the original paints and coatings that would have come on the car when it was new, and a lot of those paints and coatings disappear over the years, or somebody just paint bombs, rattle can blacks everything in an engine bay, and then you lose those original colors and coats. So it's really exciting to see all that. So it's going to make it easy for me to be able to match those different surfaces and colors as I put it all back together. And because the car had been leaking oil and had been blowing a little bit of oil, I'm not sure where the oil was being slung from, there was a nice greasy coating on everything in there too. So it also kept a lot of it from rusting. So you'll see the horn relay, the regulator, the voltage regulator that's on the fender, everything was coated with a greasy film, and so when I cleaned all that up, all the original cadmium coatings and the black finishes were all still there. So things were just really cleaning up nice, and I'm excited to get this back together. So before I put the engine and transmission back on these frame rails, I want to get that frame rails all cleaned up too. So they're also just covered with grease. And once I get all that grease off and I'm cleaning them all up, the original black finish is still on the frame. Well, the grease remover that I'm using and the wire brushing and all the cleaning is taking off a lot of that black paint. So I want to refinish all of the suspension and frame rail and the fender wells and all the parts that are going back onto this car as though I'm going to restore it to a high quality show condition. So of course, if I'm going to strip the frame rail all down and get it all ready for paint, I want to do the suspension too. Well, if I'm going to pull the suspension off and do it right, I want to make sure to clean all the bolts and do the bolts nice and silver. So if I'm going to blow everything apart, then I've got exposed ball joints, test the ball joints, they're loose, so might as well replace those. It's crazy to put it all back together with loose parts. So I'm inspecting everything. Ball joints, front tie rod ends, the balls for the drag link, everything that is in and attached to the engine bay will be cleaned, inspected, and replaced if it needs to be. There are a lot of metal parts that are in the engine bay. When it comes to the core support for the radiator, There's little attachments to the fender wells, the inner fender wells. A lot of those parts end up getting a lot of surface rust. There's some black paint and there's some rust. Trying to get that off, I'm wire brushing it, I've got a wire wheel, and it's making a big mess. And I start looking online and I'm seeing how to create an electrolysis tank where you can hang the parts in soda water and hook up a battery charger. Through electrolysis, all the rust disappears. And in addition to all the rust just cleaning itself off, a lot of the paint and grime was coming off too. So for the electrolysis tank, I filled up a 55-gallon plastic drum and I used this. One of the things I found online, a 1/4 cup of this powder per gallon of water, and then you hook up a battery charger. I've got a small 12-volt battery charger, and to get all the details, do it justice. There are a lot of videos on there, so check it out. But my tank, the way I set it up, I put on a bar, I hung chains, I hung my parts on the chains. They soak for 24 hours. Some of the parts that have some heavy rust might even take 2-3 days. But wow, does it save a lot of time. And the paint comes off, the rust comes off, the grime mostly comes off. And with just a little bit of cleaning and some sanding, all these parts were ready to paint. So it really saved a lot of time over having to wire brush or sand or grind all of the finishes down and get things ready for paint. So as I'm cleaning up all the engine bay and the frame, taking everything off of the firewall as well, so I make sure it's working. I mean, the brake system, all that has to come off. I took off the brake and brake booster, and I'm looking at it trying to think, okay, well, the brake booster is probably still good, maybe, hopefully, and the master cylinder, I took it off and it's leaking. There's fluid that's dripping around through the back side of it, so it obviously needs seals. I take it apart. Sure enough, the seals are crusty. They're not any good at all, so I need to put all new seals in the master cylinder. Cleaned it all up, and I can see the bore is nice and shiny and clean. It doesn't have any rust pits or anything in it, so it is something that's rebuildable. There are ways of testing the master cylinder to make sure it works. You can put a vacuum suction on it and see if everything moves, or you can put it through a cycle and you can plug up the hole, and if you let go of it and it doesn't go back, then the suction from that hole is holding air. I tested it, sure enough. If I push it all the way in, plug up the hole, let go of it, it doesn't go back, then it's got a good seal, there's nothing leaking. So I'm excited. Well, good. It's very expensive to replace these. They're like $350 to $600. And all the time that I'm working with it, and all the time I'm getting it ready to paint and cleaning it all up and rebuilding it, the master vacuum booster is clear full of brake fluid. And it's coming out everywhere. I don't know why it didn't before, or where it was trapped. So now I've got to take this thing apart because I know it's full of brake fluid. And brake fluid is so harsh, it really eats away a lot of surfaces. And of course, right away, it's eating away my freshly painted parts. So I had to blow that all apart. And once I got it apart, luckily I found a kit. It was still $65 for a kit to rebuild it. But then I was able to go in and clean everything all up and replace all the rubber parts inside. And it's a good thing I did end up taking it apart. There's a couple of little seals that makes things function better, that were hard, that did need to be replaced. So in the end, having it leak right at the last minute saved me from some headaches down the road. So in addition to doing the brake booster, I wanted to remove the windshield wiper motor and test it and clean it all up. Take it off, hook it up, nothing. So the windshield wiper mechanism, that needed to be reworked. Luckily, it was just all grimy and skunked from sitting for so long. Took it all apart, cleaned everything up, put it back together, works fine. It cleaned up beautifully. It's a little bit weathered, but it looks really good being remounted up there on that firewall. The firewall, when I cleaned it all up, that original paint looks fantastic. It's got some wear and tear around all the seals. There's a lot of like a tar-like material that they use to seal up all the factory joints. So those areas, the paint kind of come off of that tar a little bit. But overall, there's no rust in that paint. There's hardly any scratches in it. It cleaned up really, really nice. And right in the indentation in the middle of the firewall, there's a number. The number was 587. I don't know what that number stands for, but it was on there with a grease pencil. And that is still on there. You can see it in these pictures. So I took a lot of care to clean up that firewall and save that. And then on the heater core and the heater elements, those I wanted to clean up too. And luckily, once I took all of that apart, the heater core, when it had that water sitting in it for so long, like the engine block, the heater core had completely filled with rust too. So I don't know how it was circulating or where it was coming from, but the heater core was destroyed. So I had to take the parts out of the gray car and swap and work together on the two parts to come up with a good set for this red car. So that restored out beautifully as well. So in the future episodes, I'll show you the finished product and getting all of the front end back together. I'll be doing the body work on the front fenders. I still need to do all the fuel system. The fuel tank is a disaster, as you can imagine, from sitting for 40 years. There's ways you can put a car away and save a gas tank. I'm sure when the previous owner put it in the garage to work on it, he had no idea it was going to be sitting there for 40 years before he ever did anything with it again. So all the fuel system is destroyed in the car. It's all going to have to be reworked. All the brake system, I've completely rebuilt the front brake system while I redid all the front end, and those were rebuildable. All the seals and the parts that make the front brakes work could be salvaged. The rear cannot. It's really grimy. It's been leaking. It did get some moisture in the wheel cylinders, so they rusted. So those are going to have to be replaced. So I've got a lot of work to do in the brake system and the tail end of the car, and the fuel system and the fuel tank and everything. So in future videos, we'll start going through everything that it takes to get this car back on the road. I want to make sure it's safe. I've got to go through the fuel system. I've got to go through the rest of the brake system. I've got to go through all the wiring and the lights and get everything working, get everything back together, and get this car on the road. So stay tuned. I really appreciate you watching my videos. TTFN. Ta-ta for now.